This week, I'll be discussing some of the most common chess mistakes at the club level. If your tournament results aren't quite where you'd like them to be, it could be that you're committing one or more of these errors on a regular basis. That's coming up, so stick around. Welcome everyone, some quick housekeeping before we get started. First, I want to offer my sincere thanks to all of you for listening to the podcast and for all of your kind words. It really means a lot. A reminder, if you're interested in supporting the show, we do have a Patreon page, so you can join that and become a member. That would be for recurring support at a very low monthly price, where you'll also enjoy a few perks. If you're interested in one-time support, like a one-and-done type of thing, we have a Buy Me a Coffee page. Links for both of those are in the show notes, so you can check those out if you're interested. We certainly appreciate it. That being said, as far as supporting the show generally, and this will not cost you a penny, the best thing you can do is tell a chess-playing friend. If you're enjoying the podcast, spread the word, mention us on your social media, all that stuff. Lastly, we would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. Many of you have already, and it's greatly appreciated. Those 5-star reviews really help with discoverability, search optimization, and promotion. So again, if you would take a moment to do so, that would be great. So that's it for housekeeping. Now let's jump into the content. So here's how this episode is going to work. I'm going to be sharing what I feel are some of the most common and recurring errors committed by amateur and club players. This is based not only on my own experience, but on the thousands of games I've observed at the club. Simply put, these mistakes happen over and over again with unwavering consistency. Many players never address these holes or leaks in their game, and over time it's costing them dozens of rating points or more. I'm sure a few of these you've heard already, but they definitely bear repeating, and there are a few I've mentioned in previous episodes. But what I'm going to do this week is put my own spin on them and discuss them, hopefully in a very pragmatic manner. A lot of these aren't necessarily related to chess theory, but it's more about tournament behaviors and approaches to the game and sort of mannerisms that people have and the way that they react to their opponent. It's sort of that type of thing. I'm not really sure that reading more chess books or gaining more knowledge of theory is going to help. These are more about tournament behaviors. If you think about taking a test, let's say, just to use an analogous situation, they say when you take a test, it's not so much about the knowledge that you have of the content, but how much you know about taking a test, right? It's about test-taking strategy, not just the content. And it's the same thing with tournament chess. It's not so much about how good of a player you are or how much chess knowledge you have. I mean, that's part of it, but a lot of it also is how well you handle tournament strategy and tournament conditions. And there are players, and I've mentioned this, who have a decent chess knowledge. They have a good opening repertoire. They have a good sense of tactics. They know the basic endgames. But because they have difficulty in tournament circumstances, their progress is often limited. So that's sort of the direction I'm going in. And I hope you find these helpful and pragmatic and practical. So here we go. So the first mistake I want to discuss is becoming victim to the quote-unquote 3 major blind spots. They looked into this and they found that there are 3 moves or ideas that players of all levels miss on a regular basis. They fail to see these in their calculation, and those are retreating knight moves, retreating diagonal moves, and play along a rank, specifically with queens and rooks. Let's take each of those individually. Retreating knight moves are often hard to see, or we don't consider them in our analysis. Like, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the idea that chess, it's a very vertical game. We sort of think of moving forward, back and forth, not so much side to side. And it's more forwards than backwards. That's just kind of how our mind works. So when we look at knight moves, we often think of the squares it can go to moving forward, but we fail to appreciate or even see that they have these backward moves as well. And those backward knight moves can be very tricky. And if you miss them, it can lead to a mistake that can cost you the game. But players of all levels often fail to spot these retreating knight moves, but they can be very, very tricky. And let's face it, the knight is arguably the trickiest piece on the board. When it's combined with a queen, that's one of the most lethal attacking combinations you can have, right? If you have an attack on your opponent's king with your queen and knight, that can be lethal. And the reason is each of those pieces has abilities that the other doesn't, so they complement each other very well. If you can stick a knight on a square where it can't be kicked away with a pawn, especially like on the 6th rank, that can be devastating as well. But these retreating knight moves are very hard to miss, so be aware of those. The second one is retreating diagonal moves with the bishop or the queen. Those can be devastating as well. Now, the classic example for many beginners is that you move a piece and it can be taken by your opponent's bishop or queen, like all the way on the other side of the board, but it's a backwards capture, right? Because again, we think of moving forward, but those retreating diagonal moves can be very tricky. Not only can they capture a piece that might be hanging, but it might put the bishop or queen on a diagonal that has a threat or starts a mating net, something like that. So retreating diagonal moves is another one. The third one, and many, many tactics fall under this category, is play along a rank. For example, you'll move a rook, let's say from E1 to E5, and we just think vertically, well, what's it doing on the E file? We don't think about the side to side play. Another common theme with that is the queen, where let's say the queen moves to check, let's say something like, queen H5 check, but it's also attacking something on the rank. And again, because you're sitting across from your opponent, because of the way the board looks visually, we tend to think very vertically when we play chess. We don't think horizontally. And very often we miss that a rook or a queen can slide across. And it's not just capturing a piece. It could be that the rook or the queen moves across to an open file and can check your king, or it's threatening to penetrate into your position. So those types of plays and moves across a rank can be very, very sneaky. They can lead to a mating net. It could lead to a queen fork that captures material. And we only think of the file moving frontwards and backwards. But that side-to-side vision is a huge blind spot in many players' games. So that's something to be aware of. So just to review that, retreating knight moves, retreating diagonal moves, and play along a rank, horizontal thinking. The next mistake, and this is a big one, is the failure to see when a defensive move also has an offensive threat. Some people describe this differently. National Master Dan Heisman, I've heard him say, when an opponent moves, you need to look at all the things that the move does. I don't really like that phrasing. This is just, this is semantics. I'm kind of nitpicking here, but I don't like that phrasing because I think it's too broad. I like to say when your opponent makes a move that is defensive in nature, you also need to see if it has a threat as well. Here's a classic example. Let's say you're attacking your opponent's knight and he then moves it to safety. And now there are different ways he can handle it. He could defend it with another piece, but let's say you're attacking it with a pawn. So he moves it to safety, and very often our analysis stops there. Okay, he moved the knight because I was attacking it. But what you fail to see is now on its new square, that knight is threatening to fork one of your pieces, or that knight is threatening to sink into a hole in your position, or that knight is going to start a mating net, or moving that knight now opened his C file, let's say, and he can get a rook on there. You follow? So what happens is when your opponent moves something clearly because it's being attacked, you then have to say, okay, he moved it, but now is he also threatening something? And we fail to see that. We just think, okay, he moved the knight because I was attacking it. I can now carry on with my own plans. That's a huge, huge mistake. Happens all the time, happens at all levels, but at the amateur level, You see it all the time. It's also a problem with the queen, because if you attack your opponent's queen, because the queen is so powerful, when he moves the queen to a new square, you have to see if that doesn't come with a threat. And the queen is nasty. There could be a fork. It could be a mating net. It could be lots of things. So again, when your opponent makes a move that's clearly for defensive purposes initially, you have to also look if it also has a threat. And again, that is a huge leak in people's games, and it happens over and over again. So when you do that, when you attack a piece and he moves it to safety, you got to go that extra step. You can't just say, well, he moved it because I was attacking it. See if it also carries a threat. And remember, when he moves that piece to safety, let's use the knight as an example. You attack his knight and he moves it. Is that opening up other pieces for attack? It's not just the knight. Maybe he moves the knight and now his bishop's on an open diagonal or something, right? Maybe it was only protected once and you were attacking it twice. When he moves the knight, is it opening up a file? When he moves the knight, can he then push a pawn? Like, you have to look at all the possibilities that open up when your opponent moves a piece to safety. So it's not just for defensive purposes. Very, very important component to add to your game. The next mistake has a little bit to do with laziness and stubbornness. And that is, you think about a move and you calculate and you analyze when you have brain fog, right? I've spoken about this. Like, when you get that fuzzy brain feeling, you need to get up from the board and do a reset. As far as I'm concerned, that's really the only cure. Now, ideally, if you can do it on your opponent's time, that's best. But sometimes you do need to do it on your own time. Don't be afraid to get up from the board, even if your clock is running, because there's no point in sitting there when you're frustrated and your brain is kind of like fuzzy. You're going to end up blundering. Just walk away. And what some players do, this is a big mistake, is the opponent's moving, his clock is running, you're about to get up because you just want to clear your head, but right when you're about to get up, your opponent makes his move. And so the natural reflex is, okay, well, he just made his move, I guess I'll stay here. No, don't worry about that. If you're not feeling it, you need to get up and do a reset. As far as I'm concerned, again, that's the only thing that works. Get a drink of water, look away for a few minutes, do what you need to do. It's sort of the chess version of the 20-20-20 rule. They say when you're in front of a computer screen all day, they say to prevent eye strain and headaches, that if you're in front of a computer for work, that every 20 minutes you should look 20 feet away for 20 seconds, right? That's the 20-20-20 rule. You need to apply something analogous to your chess. It doesn't have to be as literal as 20 minutes, but you get the idea. When you're not feeling it, just step away and come back. But what many players do is they insist on staying at the board for whatever reason. They just don't feel like getting up, or they're worried about their clock, or honestly, it's just laziness. But then you end up thinking about a move when there's all this other stuff going on in your brain, and that's where the mistakes happen. And this is an example of a mistake happening not because of chess theory, but just because of your mindset. That could have easily been corrected by just getting up from the board for a minute. So this next mistake, this is a biggie. This is what I call matching. This is something that people do against an opponent who moves too quickly, who moves very fast. Now, a few initial comments about that. It can be very unsettling and sometimes downright infuriating to play an opponent who moves really quickly. I'm referring to someone who moves quickly in an over-the-board tournament game with a slow time control, right? It's like a game 90 or a game in 2 hours, and your opponent's playing like it's a 3-0 blitz game. It can be really frustrating because you're taking your time. Maybe you're taking 2, 3, 4 minutes a move, and he whips his move out in like 4 seconds. It can be very frustrating, but what happens is players end up playing the matching game. He plays so fast that you feel you have to match him and move quickly as well. Oh, well, you think you're so smart? Yeah, well, I'm smart too. I call this the ego response, where you feel like because you're not moving as quickly as your opponent, you're somehow not as intelligent or you're somehow a lesser player. Very, very easy trap to fall into. These quick moving players can be very sneaky like that. Now, I have to give them credit. If you do move quickly like that, and I'm not advocating this, but for the players who do that, some players can actually do that well. It can be a very effective strategy to force your opponent to rush. I don't play that way. I wouldn't advocate it. But against these fast-moving opponents, you can't let them get into your head. Just play your own game, because most of the time, eventually, they're going to make one fast move too many. They might make several moves in a row, but eventually you're going to catch them. And you have to be the stronger person. You need to be patient. It's sort of like the tortoise and the hare. Slow and steady wins the race. And eventually, when they keep whipping out these fast moves, they are going to trip over themselves. But many players, they start to match the opponent. And again, I think it's because of ego. And I also think it's just human nature that when your opponent does something, you can easily fall into that same pattern. So you really need to be aware of it and discipline yourself. Play your own game, take your time. And like I said, when they keep whipping those moves out, if they do that for the whole game, eventually, most of the time in my experience, it is going to catch up to them. It might not be for a while. Like, quite honestly, some of those players can hold their own for quite a bit, but that moment will happen when they do make a mistake because they needed to think and they insisted on still moving too quickly. Some players, again, do it as a strategy. Other players do it just because that's how they play and they haven't trained themselves to slow down. Maybe they're coming from the internet where they're playing a lot of 5-0 and 3-0 games. But matching is something you need to be aware of because it can be a huge problem. This next mistake is one of my favorite to talk about. It's something that your opponent can do, but it's also something that you can commit as well. And I call it temper tantrum chess. Yes, that is a self-coined term. So what is temper tantrum chess? That is where a player makes a move and then he realizes it's a blunder. Either he realizes that right away or he realizes that after his opponent's response, and he's now losing the game, and he basically has a temper tantrum on the chessboard in terms of how he moves now. So basically what happens is the player gets extremely frustrated and they just start mindlessly attacking the opponent's king, right? Let's say the player has the white pieces. He'll just push, H4, G4. He'll just do this mindless attack against the king. He just whips out moves. He doesn't think. It's basically like going on tilt. That's what temper tantrum chess is. But I see this a lot. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not something that kids do. I've seen adults do this as well. In fact, I've seen more adults do this than kids. It's very common. They get frustrated, and rather than keep their composure, look for a plan, try to come up with a contingency, they just completely lose it. And they just throw everything they can at the king, even though an attack is unsound, even though they might have some other resources, they just completely lose it. And I call that temper tantrum chess. And again, this is something you can commit yourself or your opponent might do it. It's for both kids and adults. I've seen this for all ages. If you make a mistake like that, and it's like, because believe me, I know how infuriating and frustrating that can be. To avoid temper tantrum chess, you need to walk away, step away, shake it off, and keep your composure. And I'm telling you right now, as far as I'm concerned, the only way to cure this and prevent it is plenty of over-the-board experience. I don't think there's a course you can take online or a book you can read to deal with this. It just comes with experience. And if your opponent commits temper tantrum chess and starts whipping out the move, just be careful you don't fall into the matching that I described earlier. And again, I've seen adults do this where they make a mistake, they play temper tantrum chess, they start slamming the pieces, like whipping out the pieces. Don't get sucked into that. When your opponent plays that way, just take your time and you'll eventually win because they're so frustrated and on tilt, that they're going to screw it up. Okay, so don't fall into the matching that we described earlier because I've seen that happen as well. Your opponent will be in this temper tantrum state of mind, and then the other player ends up matching him, and the temper tantrum person ends up winning because the opponent didn't step back and just take his time and let it play out naturally. So that's something to be aware of. That sort of goes hand in hand with the matching I described earlier. But my concern here is that you don't become the person who commits the temper tantrum chess. You just need to learn to keep your composure, deal with it. And unless it's a blunder that is going to lead to mate, obviously, if you blunder and it's a mate in 3 and your opponent sees it, well, I don't know if there's much you can do. But if you drop a piece or a pawn and there's other things going on, you can probably still hang in there, especially at the amateur level. There's got to be something you can work with to stay in the game, maybe fight for a draw. So something to think about. The next mistake is something I call punishing. Your opponent makes an unsound move or violates theory in some way, and then you try and win the game in like 6 moves. That's a great way to actually lose the game. When those inaccuracies happen, it still takes time, and the unsound move isn't necessarily a game-losing blunder, but again, an inaccuracy. It might be a dubious move, like question mark, exclamation point. But what happens is we see these inaccuracies because we read it somewhere in a book, or our coach told us, or we just know that theoretically it's unsound, but we think that's going to lead us to victory in just a few moves. No. You have to understand, these types of moves, while they might not be great, there's still a lot of play left. And at the amateur level, so many things can happen that you can't just assume you're going to win it right away. But this is what happens. You see like a slight inaccuracy, a slight mistake, and you think, oh, I now need to win it in like 10 moves or 12 moves. And if I don't, I'm somehow a bad player. No, it still takes time. And again, unless it's an outright blunder, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference because we're at the amateur level. Like, here's a classic example. I'm speaking very, very broadly here. Let's say your opponent has the black pieces and you open with D4, D as in David. You make a D4 opening. One of the common theoretical ideas with black against D4 openings is that you want to get in C5. You want to get that pawn thrust C5 in to attack the center. But let's say you play knight C6. You're then blocking the C pawn. So you might say, oh, he moved knight C6. That's not good. He's blocking his C pawn from attacking the center. Oh, that's a blunder. I'm going to win the game. No, it's an inaccuracy, but it doesn't mean you're going to win the game, and it's not a blunder. And if you put it in the computer, black is probably fine there, but players will see something like that and think they have to win it right away just because it's a slight inaccuracy. Now, part of the reason for that mindset, and this is a little bit of a thought experiment, some people might find this controversial, but I stand by this. I think a lot of coaches, like higher rated players who coach, they tend to catastrophize the effect of these inaccuracies at the amateur level, which causes players to overreact to them. So in other words, if you're analyzing your game with a coach, let's say you had the black pieces in the example I used. Let's say you blocked your C pawn. Coaches, I suspect, might be like, oh, no, you can't block your C pawn. That's awful. That's a mistake because you got to get in C5. And then what happens is when your opponent does that, you think, oh, my coach said that was a mistake, so I now need to punish this guy, and I'm going to, no. Like I said, coaches tend to exaggerate and catastrophize exactly how bad these inaccuracies are. The fact that your opponent blocked the C pawn at the amateur level probably doesn't matter that much. I'm going to be honest. Now, if two GMs are going at it, that might make a difference because the slightest error they're going to be able to take advantage of. But in amateur games, there's going to be so many other inaccuracies and so many other things going on that it's inconsequential. Now, for me personally, punishing was a huge, huge problem in my game. I lost a lot of games because of that. Because I would see as a positional player, especially, I think if you're a positional player like myself, you probably fall victim to punishing even more than a tactical player because you kind of into all these little positional nuances. I don't know, maybe not. That's probably not true. I guess if you're a tactical player, you could as well. But anyway, that was a big, big league for me because I would see these slight theoretical inaccuracies and I would think that it was an automatic win, and it's not. Those types of positional mistakes, but they're not blunders, those are really overrated at the amateur level as far as how bad they are. And like I said, I stick with what I said. I think a lot of coaches overemphasize how bad those mistakes are. I mean, yes, you need to tell your students that it's not correct, But you also need to tell your students that if your opponent makes this type of mistake, be aware of it, try to take advantage of it, but don't try to force the win because you're just going to get yourself into trouble. And the way that punishing causes you to lose the game is that you overpress and you're in such a rush to win it because you think you're supposed to win it because of this inaccurate move your opponent made that you end up blundering yourself and the game ends up getting turned around. I've lost many games that way. That was a huge problem for me, which I believe I've since corrected, but it took me a long time to fix that. The next mistake that's very common is falling for quote unquote chess theater. Oh yeah, there's a lot of chess theater out there. That's when your opponent acts like he blundered, but it's a trap. And what I mean is they make this move where it seems like they're hanging a piece and then they start in with the theater. Oh God, oh, I can't believe I did that. Oh, they like shake their head. When that happens, you need to really take your time and assess. Now, here's the thing. For those of you just getting into tournaments, I hate to spoil the illusion that chess is, right, the great royal game. It is. But what I mean by that is don't assume that no one would do this because, it's the royal game. It's chess, right? No one would do that in the sacred tournament hall. Yeah, they will. Yeah, they will. They're going to do it. All right. Don't assume that if someone acts out like they made a blunder, that they made a blunder. It could be that they're setting you up for a trap. This happens all the time. And again, with adults and kids, I see it all the time at the club, in other tournaments I played in. Not that much. Now, as far as my own opponents, I've only experienced this maybe 2 or 3 times. Now, what I do, if my opponent does that to me and it's like so obvious that if I take the piece, it's a trap, I basically call them out. So let's say they move their bishop and it's the type of thing where if I take the bishop because they move their bishop and it's like hanging or whatever, and I see that if I take the bishop, he's going to get like a winning passed pawn or something, or he's going to mate me. Like it's so obvious. If they start in with the theater, I just call them out on it. I actually say to them, okay, so I'm supposed to take the bishop and then you mate me? Like, is that what you want me to do here? And when I say that, I end up winning the game anyway, because at that point, they're just so flustered because 2 things happen when you call them out. Number 1, they're angry that you didn't fall for the trap. And then number 2, they're also embarrassed. Now, again, am I supposed to speak to my opponent like that in a tournament? No. But my thinking is if you're going to be cheesy like that and try to play a cheapie and do the whole theatrical routine, like, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake, I'm going to call you out, buddy. All right, that's how it is. If you push me, I'm going to push you back. So if you're going to play that little theater game with me, I'm going to call you on it. And we actually had this recently at the club. I mean, we had someone, he's probably in his 50s maybe. It was an end game. He had the rook. His opponent had the knight. It was king and pawn. And he made a move that gave up the exchange. Those of us watching, this was the last game of the evening. We were standing around. You could see that if his opponent does take his rook for the knight, if his opponent wins the exchange, the player with the rook who committed this trap, he's going to get a winning passed pawn. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, don't take the rook. Like, you can't trade here because he's going to get a passed pawn. But of course, when the player with the rook moved it, he acted like, acted like it was a blunder. He did the whole theater thing like, oh man, starts shaking his head. The opponent fell for it, and then he gets the passed pawn. And I said to him, when you pretended that you gave up the exchange, did you really think that was a mistake, or was that theater so you could get the passed pawn? And he turned like red and said, I just guess I got, and I'm like, yeah, busted, dude. I mean, what am I going to do? The game was over, but it was clearly chess theater. Now, is that against the rules? I mean, this is an interesting sort of ethical question. Is it illegal to make a move where it seems like you're blundering, but it's a trap, and then act out like, oh, I can't believe I did that? It's tough to say. I mean, it's pushing the envelope. It's probably not ethical. I don't believe there's any specific language about that in the rule book. The rule book says you're not allowed to commit annoying or distracting behavior, and there's some things on sportsmanship. It's kind of a gray area. I mean, it's not really ethical. It's not a way to play. But the point is, just to wrap this up, players are going to try that. Adults too, all ages 8 to 80, whatever it is. Players of all ages will try to do that It doesn't happen all the time. Most players aren't going to do it, but it does happen where they're setting you up for a trap and they do the whole thing. They act like they're exasperated because they want you to take the piece because it's going to lead to a winning position. Don't fall for that. Just don't assume, again, because it's the royal game. Like, who would do that? What person would do that? This is chess, right? This is a distinguished game. They do it, right? They do it, buddy. They're going to do it, buddy. Sorry, that was like a bad Jesse Cry imitation. Anyway, something to be aware of. This next mistake I've mentioned before, but it bears repeating. This is where you play an unsound, quote unquote, active move when you don't understand the position rather than playing a waiting move. I've spoken about waiting moves and the power of that and how you should do that rather than try to force something where you don't understand the position. So in other words, we're constantly told, right, you have to play more actively, right? Play active. That's too passive, right? Our coaches are telling us, that's too passive. Play more active. But the issue is, and this is a big thing with me, many players will make a quote unquote active move that might even be correct. That might even be the best move, but they don't understand what they're playing and they don't understand the follow-up and they end up blundering and losing the game. Now, I know this is going to be a controversial statement, but it makes zero sense, I think, to play a move that you somehow know, maybe intuitively, you quote unquote know it's the right move. But if you're so nervous about it that you don't know the follow-up, don't play it because you're going to screw it up down the line. I'd rather you just concede, okay, I know this might be the right move, but I really don't understand what's happening. I'm going to play this nothing move and pass it to my opponent. And at least I'm not blundering. I'm not nervous. I feel better about the position. I truly feel it's better to play a waiting move than to play a quote unquote active move that you don't understand that's going to get you into trouble. In other words, it's better to simply not blunder and maybe the move is labeled as too passive than to play this active move and you end up blundering. And this goes back to, again, I think a lot of coaches and maybe some books and some courses, they catastrophize these passive moves like it's the end of the world. Like you're going to lose the game because, you missed this move that was so much more active. Okay, fine. You learn from that and you do it next time. But just because you missed it in this one game and you played a waiting move that was safer and you didn't blunder the game, that's much better than trying to push things. So don't get so obsessed with this whole like active move idea if you don't understand what you're doing. And then what you do is you go back, you analyze the game, you internalize, and guess what? When you have that position again, now you understand how to play that active move. All right. It's kind of like you wouldn't use a piece of machinery or something that's much more professional and much more complicated than a basic model just because you want a better result, right? You're better off using something that's not as complicated, that doesn't have the bells and whistles, where you understand how to use it and you'll be safe, rather than try and push things. I don't know. That was probably a lame analogy, but you kind of get the idea. I'd rather you play a passive move that you understand than an active move that's going to confuse you down the line where you're going to lose the game. Next mistake are playing weakening pawn moves, especially unsound pawn pushes early in the game. A very common example, I'll go back to the Queen's Pawn game, is in these D4 openings, many players will play D4, D5 way too early in the game before developing their other pieces. I had a game recently where this happened. I was black, my opponent played D4, and then I responded with E6, which is one of my favorite responses to D4. I've spoken about that. And then he played C4, and then I played B6. And then what happened is within a few moves, he pushed D4 to D5 pretty early right away, which is unsound. It was very impatient. It was very forcing. He should have kept his pawn on D4, developed his pieces. And what happened was when he went D4 to D5, I was able to go Queen F6 as black. So it's on that H8, A1 diagonal. It was very vulnerable because his B2 pawn is weak. His rook is hanging in the corner. And that's what happens when you play a pawn move. I mean, we'll talk about playing it early in the game, but at any point in the game, every time you play a pawn move, remember, it's no backsies. Okay, pawns can't go backwards, right? We talked about missing backwards moves with knights, but with pawns, you don't have to worry about that. Well, I mean, you have to worry about the weakness it creates, but obviously you can't move a pawn backwards. But the point I'm trying to make is every time you push a pawn forward, while it may be a strength, it also creates a weakness because it's giving up squares. It could be giving up a diagonal, right? Every time you push a pawn, you have to look for the weaknesses and the responses of your opponent. So after an early d4 to d5 and a queen pawn opening, you're opening up that diagonal, the h8, a1 diagonal, and I was able to go queen f6, and it caused my opponent's problems. You know, he had to really think for a while. I had a really good position, but it was a premature pawn push early in the opening. All right, develop your pieces. Only make those kinds of moves if for some reason it's tactically appropriate based on some strange response by your opponent. But just be aware of those. Any type of weakening pawn move, but especially early on in the game, because then your opponent can develop his pieces with tempo. Because if you push the pawn prematurely, your opponent can develop and attack something. Now let's talk about clock management. Classic problem for players of all levels. But what I notice at the amateur level, it's a question of players moving too fast or too slow, right? They move too quickly or too slowly. And we have a number of players at the club who do this on a regular basis. All right, you don't want to play so fast that you blunder, but obviously you don't want to play too slow that you're in time pressure. And we have one player, let's take each of those separately. We have one player where I feel like he thinks it's his goal to move as quickly as possible, or he thinks that the result is determined by who has more time left on their clock. There were even a few times where he showed me his clock at the end of the game, like, oh, look how much time I had. And I felt like saying, what is wrong with you? That's no time to be bragging. You know, that's like an extra 45 minutes you could have been thinking. Your time is there to use. But I can't seem to get through to him, and his moving too quickly has cost him a lot of games. In fact, I think I spoke about this in an earlier episode. There was one time he lost the game, but he showed me, yeah, but look at how much time I had on my clock. I lost the game, but I had 50 minutes left and he only had 5 minutes. I'm like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, that means your opponent, right? I mean, he used his time well. He won the game and he had 5 minutes left. That's what you're supposed to do. Your time is there to use, but it's an issue. We have another player who just moves way too slowly, who's taking time on moves that he shouldn't be. It'll be a standard opening. Let's say e4, e5. Let's say he has the black pieces, e4, e5, and he's taking 6 minutes to make move 2. You can't be doing that. Not with the time controls that exist nowadays. But we have players that do that. They're just moving way too slowly on move 3 or move 4. And these are in standard book openings. Now, if your opponent plays something crazy right out of the gate, that's an exception where you kind of do have to take your time, because that's where we get into matching and things like that. But players moving too fast or too slow, they're both a problem, which leads to the next issue, which falls under the umbrella of clock management. And that is, players, they do not play at a pace that is commensurate with the time control that they're using. For example, if you're playing at a major weekend event and it's something 40 moves in 2 hours with a 30-second increment, whatever it is, one of those really, really long classical time controls, then yes, you can take your time more. You don't have to worry about perfectionism as much. Perfectionism, of course, is where you're constantly looking for the perfect move all the time, when adequate moves are often okay and will save you time in the long run. Obviously, if it's a very, very slow time control, perfectionism is less of an issue. But in club controls, you need to make a decision. For example, our club, typical club control, it's game 90 with a 10-second delay. Some clubs might have game 90 with a 5-second delay or even a 30-second delay, whatever it is. But game 90, pretty standard. And the reason I like game 90, it's slow enough that you can play a thoughtful, strategic game and take your time, but it's quick enough that you're not there all night, right? We all have lives. We all have to get up for work the next day. Some of the kids who come to the club, right? Obviously they have school. we don't want to be there till midnight or 1 a.m. So that's why I like game 90. It's like reasonable. It's a good balance. It's the perfect balance of being able to play a strategic game, but, like I said, not being there all night and getting home at a fairly reasonable hour. But anyway, game 90 is very common. But what I tell people, I go with a game 90, because when players at the club sometimes ask me about their time pressure issues, I go, look, it's a game 90. Like you have to make a decision. That's what I tell them. I go, you can't obsess. You can't obsess. Like, do I take back with the bishop or do I take back with the queen? When 90% of the time it probably doesn't matter. You can move your rook to an open file. I've spoken about the which rook scenario many, many times. Do I go rook A to E1 or rook F to E1? Most of the time, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you check it for tactics, but it probably doesn't matter. You can't be taking 7 minutes to decide which rook to put on the file when it probably doesn't matter. You need to make a decision. Now, I'm not saying you should rush, but you have to, in a game 90, you have to save those moves where you're taking like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes on one move for those really critical positions. Because if you start taking 5, 6 minutes on one move, like 2 or 3 moves in a row, you're going to be in time pressure for the rest of the game. I mean, the delay will help you to a certain extent, but again, you have to play at a pace that's commensurate with the time control. You need to make a decision. You need to know what openings you're going to play, although that's true for all time controls, but you get the idea. Game 90 is going to be a different approach to clock management than, like I said, a weekend event with like 40 moves in 2 hours with multiple time controls, that type of thing. But many players don't make that adjustment. They'll sit down for a game 90 as if they're playing a classical like 40 move in 2 hour type of thing. Or they'll be at a classical game and they're playing it like it's a game 30. You have to play, again, at a pace that matches the time control. Again, that comes with experience, that comes with trial and error, but it's something to be aware of. So for our final mistake, I'm going to leave you with this, and that is not calling out your opponent or getting the TD for distracting behavior and then complaining afterwards. I don't get this. Why are you allowing yourself to suffer through this? I'll see posts on Twitter. I'll see people even at my own club or at other clubs. It's like, oh, I was playing this kid and he kept fidgeting the whole time. He kept slamming the pieces and it was so distracting and I ended up losing the game. That's your own fault in a way. You should have said something immediately. Now, I get it. Some people, they feel uncomfortable saying something or they don't like confrontation or they're just more comfortable kind of suffering in silence. But that makes no sense. These people need to be called out. If your opponent's a child, that may feel awkward, but you can say, excuse me, do you mind? Can you kind of sit still? I would appreciate it. And very often that will work. They're going to be so sort of startled and caught off guard that you actually said something that they'll stop. I would say about 70 to 80% of the time, just politely saying something to your opponent will often make it stop. Now, if it doesn't, that's where you need to get the TD over. And when the TD comes, like with these TDs, you have to really advocate for yourself and make eye contact with the TD and just be like, look, I need you to make it clear that this behavior is not acceptable. Don't just like give him a warning and walk away. Like you need to tell him that if it continues, like you're going to do something because otherwise it's not going to, do anything. If the TD just walks over and says, yeah, can you stop doing that? Thank you. And walk away. That's not going to do anything. But you need to say something. If your opponent is doing something distracting, whatever, tapping their fingers, hovering their hand over the board constantly, if they're adjusting their pieces on every move, that's a big one. If they're standing up all the time or for the whole game, okay, like what are you making a speech? Sit down, stay a while, let's play some chess. You're not going to stand over me and hover over the board for the whole game. That's distracting behavior. You need to say something, right? Or if they're slamming the pieces, if they're not keeping score, like I said, if they're fidgeting, if there's some other just idiosyncrasy that they're doing. Again, I'm not talking about like a medical issue, right? I'm not being unreasonable here. I'm just talking about something that's clearly just distracting and inappropriate. You need to say something. And like I said, most of the time that'll fix it. But if not, you need to get the TD. These people need to be called out because otherwise they're just going to keep doing it. But here's the most important point. It's not fair to you as a player that you should have to suffer through that. You're there to play chess, have a good time. Obviously, you want to win the game. It's not fair to you that you should have to deal with that behavior. You shouldn't be having that type of experience. So you need to say something. But over and over and over again, I hear people complaining afterwards, and then there's really nothing we can do. There's nothing we as TDs can do once a result is posted. That's generally the rule. Okay. Once the players agree to a result and it's posted on the pairing sheet, that's pretty much a done deal. What do they call that? A fait accompli, right? It's done. You need to say something during the game. But again, people get lazy. They don't want to get up. I don't want to make a scene. Yeah, make a scene. Make a scene. Make a big scene, because these people need to be called out. And from what I'm hearing at a lot of the major events, I don't really play in those recently just because of my schedule. I haven't played it at a major weekend event in years. I'm just doing the club right now. This is a major problem at weekend events from what I'm hearing. And I see people post about this all the time. Oh, my opponent was doing this the whole game. My opponent was doing that the whole game. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, why didn't you say something? If you see something, say something. I know I'm babbling a little bit about this, but you have the right as a player in a rated tournament to pause your clock and get the TD when something like this is going on. That's in the rule book. You have the right to do that. Say something politely to your opponent. And if he or she doesn't respond, that's when you pause the clock and you say, I'm getting a TD. You know, I spoke to you about this, but you're not doing anything. And then once the TD comes over, like in how I said about 70% of the time or so, if you say something to your opponent, they'll probably stop. Once you get the TD over, then the likelihood is that they'll definitely stop, because now you're making a thing out of it. Now, if they still behave that way even after the TD comes over, you know, then you're dealing with a live one. Then that's kind of messed up. And that's where you need to call the TD again. But I realize then it's the whole thing, like it's throwing off your train of thought. It's distracting your game. It's making it worse. Some people may feel it's actually better to not say something. I don't agree with that. I get it. This is, you know, there's a lot of opinions on this. The point I'm making is with distracting behavior, you can and should pause your clock and get the TD. That's why they're there. So that will do it for this week. We covered a lot of ground regarding mistakes. Again, some quick reminders. If you're interested in supporting the show, be sure to check out our Patreon page or our Buy Me a Coffee page. Links for those are in the show notes. For general support, again, spread the word, tell a chess playing friend. And if you would take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app of choice, we would be greatly appreciative. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and I hope you win your next game.